Well, good morning. So glad you're here this morning as we begin Thanksgiving week. One of the things I'm really thankful for this year is I have two kids, and my daughter, and now subsequently my son, have entered the phase where they ask why about everything. Anybody else had this moment, like had this happen in their lives? Oh my goodness. And so I'm open for tips after this if you can give me any helpful advice. You feel this intrinsic need to give them a real answer for almost everything. Even things that you have no answers for, even things where you're gonna struggle with the answer, you feel like I have to tell them something, right? And then they think, well, Dad's not a complete moron because he knows something. And so I'm trying my best. I figured out a little system, and it's where I use the inverse of whatever they say, and I recite it back to them. So if the question is, Daddy, why is it daytime? Then I answer, because it's not nighttime, Jane. Why is it nighttime? Because it's not daytime, Jane. Wow, Dad is smart. Why are we eating at a restaurant today? Because we're not eating at home. Why are we eating at home today? Because we're not eating at a restaurant. It's a brilliant move until the other day I got hit with, Daddy, why is there weather? And I was like, because the moon and the sun and the lunar calendar with the ecosystem of the ocean and the glacial movement because God made weather, because of God. Take that, kid. Because of God, there's weather. It was a little more difficult. So we had this crisis the other day. We're at the end of it was the end of the day, and we had this. I woke up that morning and things were fine in the morning, but our shower was a little cold, and we were like, something's a little weird. And so the day progressed, and we thought, no big deal. Something's up with the water heater, but not a big deal. My wife is later walking by the front of our garage door, and as she's walking by, she sees water streaming out from underneath our garage door. Our water heater is located inside of our garage, and she went inside to look, and there's about 4 inches of standing water throughout our entire garage. And we had some things on the floor. We were actually getting ready for a garage sale, so we have stuff everywhere, and it's all kind of ruined and whatever. So we call the plumber. Plumber comes out, and of course he looks at it and says, I think what they say every time, which was, I've never seen this before. Well, I'm glad we could be the first. And so he's looking at it, he's like, this container bust, it just burst inside of it, and there's water everywhere. And he was like, so I'm replacing these containers. And he was like, this thing's brand new, what happened? I was like, I don't know, that's why we hired you. And so he's looking at it, and so he leaves, and he's kind of like, and so we talked to him a little bit about, so we got to get this cleaned up. He was like, yeah, you're going to want to let the floor dry in the garage, so get everything out, let the floor dry, and then bring everything back in. And so we're trying to figure out how we're going to do that. So some friends chip in to help. So some friends of ours, Greg and Lori Horn, call us, and they said, hey, what if we take the kids for you? So we'll take the kids to our pool, they can play, you guys just focus on getting your garage cleaned out, which was great. So they take the kids. Then Annie and Wes called, they said, we'll come over and help you clean out the garage. And so they come in and they help us actually clean out the garage. And then my good friend Rob England, he goes out of his way and sends me a text that says, hey, heard your garage is flooded. That's too bad. And then he sent a second text that said, good luck. And so Rob really chipped in with some moral support. So I really appreciated that. Yeah, thanks, man. No, but he did actually, after that, he did send a text asking if he could help, because I'm sure Becky told him, Rob, send a text asking if you can help. So he did send a text offering to help, but people chipped in and they were helping out. So we got the garage cleaned out, and Wesley and I, we take some things to some dumpsters behind Kmart's, because we're those people. And then my wife goes to Target and buys out the Rubbermaid section, because we found out that boxes, when submerged underwater, do not hold up well. So she goes and she gets all these Rubbermaids. So we come back to meet together, and we're about done with everything. And Wesley and I pull into the driveway, and shortly thereafter, Marie and Annie, they pull into the driveway. My wife gets out of the car and she looks at me and she says, Kevin, I think we might have to go to the emergency room. I looked at her, I said, what did you do at Target? And she was like, no, Jane fell, our daughter, she fell at the Horns' house, and they were getting out of the pool, and she decided to climb up on a table and try to reach these wind chimes, and she lost her balance, and she fell. And when she fell, she didn't have that that instinctive thing where you at least put your hands down or you try to stop yourself? She literally just fell, and she stopped herself with her forehead right on the pool of concrete. And I mean, it was nasty. She fell directly on her head. And so they're all concerned. She may have a concussion. There may be something wrong. And they said, do you want to go straight to the ER? And I said, no, bring her home first. Let's see how she's acting, see if there's anything to worry about. So they're bringing her home, and Lori asked her, she said, Jane, is there anything we can do to make you feel better? And my little 4-year-old daughter looked at her with tears in her eyes, and she said, I think I need a milkshake. And I wasn't even mad. That's amazing. I was so proud of my daughter for literally milking this situation for all it was worth. Good for her. And so Lori stops and gets her the biggest milkshake you've ever seen to make up for her head that is now gonna never go back to normal. And so she brings her on home, and we get her, we see her, and I'm thinking she's had a milkshake and she's acting normal and she doesn't have a concussion, everything's fine. So she's sitting on my lap and we're talking, and I'm looking at her head, and I mean, it's like it's not even like a goose egg. It's like she's a baby unicorn. Like it's protruding like this perfect knot just protruding right off her head. It's purple. She's got black eyes. She's got scabs down her nose. And she's sitting on my lap, and I said, babe, did you climb up on that table? And she said, yeah. And I said, see, this is why we don't stand on tables. And she goes, why don't we stand on tables, Daddy? Do you remember what just happened? Do you remember? Please tell me you remember, because otherwise you have a concussion. And she remembered, and she said, yeah, I fell off the table. I said, yeah, that's why we don't stand on tables. She said, well then, Daddy, why do we have tables? It's like, because daddies need places to eat food. I didn't know what to tell her. And the truth is, when you think about why do we have tables, why are there tables in our lives? Tables represent huge moments in our lives. So much of our life is spent around tables, and we do a lot of life around tables. Maybe you were sitting at a table one day with butterflies in your stomach as you sat across from somebody on your very first date. And you sat across the table from them and got to know them for the first time. Maybe it was at a table where that person proposed to you or you proposed to them across a table. Maybe it was on your wedding day after the ceremony, and you have a reception, and you and your new groom or your new bride are sitting at a table together with all your groomsmen, all your bridesmaids, and you sit at that long reception table all together. Or maybe you're one of those antisocial couples who you just get your table for just the two of you. It's fine. You don't have to like the people that come to your wedding. You can be all by yourself. We get it. But maybe it was at a table you sat after that wedding. Maybe you sat at a table for a birthday, and you had people over, and you sit around the table, and you have dinner, you have cake. Maybe it was the day that somebody looked at you and said that they wanted a divorce. You were sitting at a table. Things didn't line up the way you thought they would. Maybe it was at a table where you were sitting and you had to tell somebody a diagnosis that you'd received that you were scared of. Maybe it was at a table where you got to sit and tell somebody that you were pregnant for the first time. A lot of life happens around tables. This week we do one of the coolest things that we do every year around a table, where we celebrate Thanksgiving. It's one of the few times where we set aside time as families, as loved ones, to sit around a table and to remember what we're thankful for. And this isn't new. Jesus sat around tables a lot. Jesus would be at tables a lot. If you read through the New Testament, you'll see Jesus at tables with people who were the religious elite and the most irreligious people you've ever heard of. He would sit at tables with Pharisees, and he would sit at tables with prostitutes. Jesus sat at tables with anybody who would ask him to. And that is one thing that pastors still do very well to this day, is if you have an open seat at a table, invite us. We'll come eat your food. We don't mind. But that's what Jesus would do. He was always at tables with people. He did so much ministry around tables. When he met Matthew, when he calls Matthew to become an apostle, he's sitting at a table with Matthew. When he talks to Zacchaeus, remember when he goes to Zacchaeus and he says, Zacchaeus, you come down because I'm going to your house today, meaning I'm going to go to your house and you're going to feed me. And then they went to his house and they sat down and had dinner, and Zacchaeus had a change of heart. It was at a table. Jesus was at a table when Mary and Martha were serving him, both in separate ways. Remember where Mary sits at his feet and Martha works in the kitchen. And they serve him in different ways, but he was at a table. And I think Jesus sees serving and he sees being at a table differently than you and I. There's a lot deeper value to what Jesus says. When Jesus says, he says in Matthew 20, verse 28, he says, the Son of Man, meaning him, did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, right? He says, I didn't come to be served, but I came here to serve other people. And that word served, I found this very interesting, but that word served that he uses there, it is literally talking about food preparation and food service. That word, before Jesus uses it, actually is only found in Greek literature to mean food service. It means literally preparing food and serving that food. That's what it actually means. And so Jesus says that he didn't come to be served, but to serve. Literally, food service is what he's talking about. That's why I always tip really well, because waiters and waitresses, you're just doing the will of God, you know? And the other day I had a waitress bring me a sweet tea instead of an unsweetened tea. I thought, God wants me to have this sugar today. So I drank it in obedience. But that's what Jesus is talking about. He's literally talking about food service. Actual food service is what that word means. That he didn't come to be served, but to serve. So I want to look at some stories of Jesus around tables. Just a couple of stories that show us a bigger picture of what Jesus is talking about when Jesus is at a table. And so I want to pick up Luke 14. There's a story where Jesus is sitting with some Pharisees. And it's a really interesting story where he gives us a little bit of an insight of what he's looking for when he sits at a table. He's at a Pharisee's house, and it's a prominent Pharisee. It says this in in chapter 14, verse 1. It says, one Sabbath, so it's on a Sunday or on a Sabbath day, and a Sabbath day was when people didn't do work. The Jewish community was known, they did not do things on the Sabbath. It was forbidden by the religious custom to do anything, really. So they had very strict laws about what they could and couldn't do. And Jesus is there on a Sabbath. When Jesus went to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. And there in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. I don't know about you, but around this time of year, my body also swells. But this man had what would be known as like dropsy type of thing. He had some swelling in his body. And so Jesus looks at the Pharisees, knowing that they're paying attention to him, and he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? You guys tell me, am I allowed to do something on the Sabbath or not? And they remained silent. So, taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Don't you wish it was just that easy? But he just takes hold of the man, heals him, sends him on his way. Like, we did it. Take a number. Who's next? I mean, that's amazing. It's all in one sentence that Jesus just heals a man. The Pharisees remained silent that he just did something on the Sabbath. So then he pushes a little bit further, and Jesus is getting a little chippy with these guys. And he says, then he asked them, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? And what Jesus is saying there is, if you had something that needed to be tended to right away, wouldn't you do it? What's funny about this verse, this is just a side note, this is free, you can take this home. But in some translations, the word child is translated as donkey, which I don't know how those are interchangeable terms. Like, oh man, do we have a child or was it a donkey? I need to get a sitter, but I can't remember which kind of sitter I need, a donkey or a babysitter. Anyways, but if this child or this ox falls into a well, wouldn't you do something about it? Wouldn't you get after it real quick? And they had nothing to say. So Jesus is already pushing the envelope with these Pharisees. Then he takes it a step further at this dinner party, and he says some things that are really, really powerful. And it says, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. Now, in this day and age, there were places of honor at the table. So the host would sit at the head of the table, and then everybody kind of filled in around him. I don't know if you've had this moment where there's this awkwardness when you're at somebody else's house, and you're about to sit down for dinner, and that awkward moment where you're kind of like looking around like, are there assigned seats, or do I just take any seat? How does this work? Do you guys have assigned seats? I don't want to take the wrong seat. For me, I usually look for where the food is that I want to sit next to, and I sit there. But there's a seat of honor that the head of the household or the host would have. And they would sit at the seat of honor, and then people would fill around them, and they would designate the closer you got to that host, really kind of the more important you were to the dinner party. The host kind of got to say, these are the people I want to sit near me. They're the most interesting, or they're the people I want around me to hang out with. I want to talk to them, or they're the most esteemed in our society, so I want them sitting near me. So everybody took their seats, and Jesus is watching. Who takes these important seats? Who goes closest to the host? Who's the people that think that they're pretty important? And then he tells them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, then the host will come, and he'll come to you and say, give this person your seat. And then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. Now, this is kind of a parable, but it's also just a good life lesson. That if you sit in that higher seat, maybe than what you think you are, or maybe even if it's where you should sit, if you sit up there, it's possible that that host is going to come up and say, you need to switch seats with somebody else. And it'll be really humiliating. My brother, he's a large man. My brother's a very large man. Some of you knew Pastor Chip, who was here on staff for a lot of years. And my brother is on staff with Pastor Chip. They're both pastors up in North Carolina. And Pastor Chip's on the left in this picture. My brother's on the right. My brother makes Pastor Chip look like a normal-sized human. That's how large my brother is. He's a very large man. This is them. This is their staff in North Carolina. This is their staff forming the most terrifying barbershop trio you've ever seen. I'm trying to convince them to do like some kind of pastor's football league or something. I don't know. They're huge. But my brother's a very big man. And I remember we got on an airplane one time. We were sitting up front. And my family was taking up a row. And we take up a row pretty well. And my brother was sitting next to me, and the stewardess comes over, this sweet little gal. She comes over and she gets in her face and she says, sir, and she looks right at my brother, sir, we need to redistribute the weight of the plane. Now, this is a large plane. This is not a puddle jumper. This is a large plane. And she says, so I'm going to have to ask you to switch seats with somebody else. It's for the safety of the other passengers. Which, I mean, how do you say no then? Like, no, I want us all to die. So he was like, okay. So we're assuming in our heads that like 20, 30 people are going to get up and all switch places across the plane. It's going to be a huge musical chairs. Nope. It's just him and one little old lady. I watch him as he walks to the back of the plane looking around like, what? Is this all it takes for this thing to go down? So it would be humiliating, but the host would have to come to you and say, we need to switch seats. You need to switch seats. And here's the thing that Jesus is saying is, you're either going to get called out like that, or you're going to get called up. And he goes on, he says, but when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of the other guests. He's saying, don't take the highest place, go down to that lowest place, humble yourself, and come on down, because it's better to be called up than it is to be called out. And he's saying, don't worry about the top seat there, maybe move yourself on down to the kids' table for a little bit. How many of you at holiday parties, holiday family functions, you have a kids' table, right? And I remember I was at the kids' table for a lot of years in my life. I was one of the younger people in our whole clan. And there was one year where my dad, he was at the adult table, obviously, and we would play games after dinner. And we played, we played board games or playing cards or whatever, because you can pray for our salvation. We did play with playing cards. And they would come, we'd play these cards. And how many of you play euchre? Anybody play euchre? So I was playing a game at the kids' table called Uno. Not everybody knows what that means. It means one. I'm bilingual, and so it's one in Spanish. But we were playing a game called Uno, and my dad's playing euchre, and he didn't have a partner at the moment, and he's over at the big kids' table, And he looks at me, he's like, hey, Kevin, why don't you come play euchre with me? See you later, little kids. I marched on over there and I climbed up in that chair and we played euchre for a while. And it's a big move to go from the kids' table to the adult table, right? It's a big move to go from the lowest to the highest, and that's something that you're proud of. That's something you want to happen. You'd rather be called up than be called out. And that's what Jesus is saying here. And he tells them, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, I don't think anybody in this room wants to admit that we would probably, if we were ranking ourselves right now, that we would probably rank ourselves higher than we should. It's just kind of the way we're wired. We're just wired to sometimes think of ourselves more highly than we really should. Guys, especially, I only say this because I am one. I know how we think, and there's many moments where we think that we are way higher on the status, on the social, on the importance scale than we really are. There's a lot of moments where we take credit for a lot of things. I know for me, I've learned that having a wife is a really good thing to keep you humble, because you wake up in the morning, and guys, we wake up in the morning, at least me, you wake up in the morning and you wake up and you're like, that's like 1,000,000 points because I woke up today. And then you go to work and it's like, that's 2,000,000 points because I went to work. And then you come home and you're like, I talked to our kids. That's like 6,000,000 points or something. And then if you ever let your wife leave the house for a little bit without the kids, you're like, that's like 10,000,000 points. I kept these kids, I kept them entertained. I didn't lose any of them today. That's like 10,000,000 points. And we keep this huge grading scale of how great we are in our minds. The great thing about having a wife is you wake up in the morning, you realize that's 1 point. And you go to work and that's another point. And you come back home, you talk to the kids, well, that may be a point. I'm not even sure. It keeps you humble. It keeps you more grounded on what's really happening. We keep scoring the millions, guys. There's moments where we have to realize that we're not maybe as much as we think we are. Also, generation around my generation, let's just say that. Millennials, postmoderns, that generation, people around my age, there's a lot of times where we get ahead of ourselves too. I was reading a study they did with a huge amount of business leaders and church leaders. And these people who were doing this study went to all these church leaders and business leaders and said, if you had one word, one adjective to describe the next generation, what would you say? What would that word be? And almost unanimously, hundreds of business and church leaders all agreed on one word. And so they came back to some of these millennials and postmoderns, some people around my age, and they came back to them and they said, what would you think that word would be? What do you think that word is that everybody was saying about you? And they had tons of guesses and none of them were even close. And so they were like, let's give you a hint. It starts with an E. And so they're thinking, they're like, man, we're the next generation. And so it's probably like energetic or excited, or entertaining or something. And they said, no, the word that was almost unanimous was entitled. And guys, people around my age, there's a truth to that we have grown up with a lot being handed to us, and we expect it to just keep happening. And there's times where we look at ourselves on the rung of importance at this table, and we would place ourselves higher than we ought to. And Jesus doesn't even say, go to where you actually belong. He doesn't even say, look at the table, assess all the people in the room, and then think, I think I'd be about this chair. Don't even do that. He says, assume wherever you are, that's fine, but go to the bottom. Go to the least. Don't even go to where you maybe belong in the scale of things. Go on down to the bottom, and that way, when the host sees you, he'll call you up instead of call you out. So Jesus has another moment where he's at a table. If we fast forward just a little bit through Luke, there's this next moment where he's at a table. And the next moment that he's at the table is Luke 22, and you very well probably know this story. For Jesus is sitting at a table with his disciples. And you would think the disciples would have picked up on what Jesus has been teaching them, right? You would think that the disciples would understand what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about serving and the table and where you're seated. You would think he would have been clear enough with them that they would get it, but they don't. And so they're sitting at this table, again, another huge moment at a table. And Jesus at this table, it says this, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Meaning, I'm going to die. He's giving them this foreshadowing. I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die. And this is the last time I'm going to eat with you guys, have this Passover supper until that happens. And then what he does next is huge. They're seated at the table. And what he does is he literally serves them with food. In food preparation, he actually takes food and he serves them. And they have no idea the depth of the service that he's giving to them. It says he took the bread and he gave thanks and he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body. Do this in remembrance of me. And then he takes the cup the same way. This is the cup. It's the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. He's saying, I'm showing you the ultimate act of service that's about to happen. This is service to the extreme. I'm serving you this here on earth, but there's something much bigger and much more powerful where I'm serving you with my entire life. And then he goes on. He says, but the hand of him who is going to betray me is with me on the table. And the Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to the man who betrays him. So he's talking about Judas, and he's saying somebody's going to betray me. And then it says, they began, meaning the disciples, they began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. So then they start pointing fingers. Who's going to betray him? And then get this, okay, you would think that Jesus has been clear enough. And then it says this, a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Dudes, did you miss the whole thing? Like, what happened here? Were you not at dinner? Did you not just see this whole thing? Jesus has just served you the ultimate sacrifice. He's seated at the table with you, telling you, take the lowest spot you can find at the table. And he's serving you with the sacrifice. And now you're going to debate who's going to be the greatest, who's going to be seated at the seat of honor next to Jesus in the kingdom of heaven, who's going to have the best rank and file at the table. That's what they're looking at. And Jesus goes on, he tells them, you're not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For greater, who is greater, the one at the table or the one who serves? Now, Jesus has just drawn a line in the sand. Jesus just talked about two locations. Who is greater, the one at the table or the one in the kitchen? The one who's serving, the one who's making that food. Is it not the one at the table? Isn't he the better one? Isn't he the greater person? But Jesus says, but I am among you as one who serves. See, what he's saying here is, guys, you've got it all wrong. Here's the problem. If you follow after Jesus, the problem is you think you're seated at the table. But if you follow Jesus Christ, you're in the kitchen. You don't get to sit at the table. Because Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve. He's back in the kitchen. He says, who's greater? The one at the table, the one who's serving? Because I'm going to serve. What are you going to do about it? There's a story of a woman who was very influential in my life, and to be honest, I barely know her. When I was 9 years old, my dad was really sick, and we lived in Casper, Wyoming. And I remember every single morning, this church, this body of believers had decided to serve my family and literally serve us with food. They knew the way to our hearts, and they brought us food like crazy. My dad was dying, and we knew he wasn't going to make it much longer. And this church took us in, and we were there as the pastor's family, right? We're called to serve the community there, and the community there is serving us. And they're bringing us food, and they're taking care of us. And every single morning at 5:30 in the morning, there was a loaf of bread that was still warm that would be dropped off on our doorstep. It would be tied around the handle on the screen door. It was put in a paper bag so it didn't sweat so much, so it stayed warm, and then it would be put in a plastic bag that would be tied around the handle. And I remember every single morning at 5:30, this woman would drop off bread on our doorstep. And she had no idea some 9-year-old kid was gonna remember this years later, and that he was gonna have this picture of a church that was so powerful because it cared about people who were a part of it, and it cared about people who weren't part of it. That a church would serve in that way. And she literally served us every single morning. I was talking to my mom about this story just this week. I was talking to her, I told some friends about it, and it was a really powerful moment. I called my mom, I said, that woman who served us, I said, that was just such a powerful thing. And she said, well, Kevin, you remember who it was, right? And I said, it was Miriam. And she goes, no, it wasn't Miriam. She said, Miriam was a woman in our church who did a lot of great things for you, and she did make your birthday cakes and took care of you as your dad was sick. But she said it wasn't Miriam, it was a woman named Julie Skillman. She said Julie had been diagnosed with cancer of her own, right around the same time. And Julie had bought a bread maker because she wanted to start eating more natural food, hoping it would prolong her own life. And Julie went to the gym that was right around the corner from our house every single morning at 5:30 to go swim to keep her health as good as she could while she went through chemotherapy. And if anybody had a reason to be sitting at the table, it was Julie. But Julie understood that she was a follower of Jesus Christ, and so she took herself away from the table and let us sit at it. And she served us. Rather than saying, I'm here to be served, I came to serve. There's a really simple thing I want to do this morning. And in your bulletin, there was a little card. It looks like this. It's a little table place card. And as we gather around a week with Thanksgiving, where we realize that God has blessed us so much, we have to remember that God has blessed us so that we can be a blessing to others. God has served us so that we can serve others. Jesus served his disciples so they could go serve others. And when we sit in this room, we have to realize there are people who need a seat at that table. That we need to give up our seat for somebody else. We need to let somebody else sit at the table and be served, and we will go to the kitchen and we will be the ones serving. If we want to be more people becoming more like Jesus, we have to be willing to say, I didn't come here to be served, I came to serve. And you can have my seat at the table and I'll go to the kitchen. This card, there may be somebody in your life that you think of right now that needs your attention. They need a phone call from you. They need some time where you're a shoulder that they can cry on. They may need something physical where you actually need to go help them out with something at their house, something in their life. They may need you to reach out to one of their kids, to a spouse, to somebody to help them out. There's probably somebody, if you think about it, who needs a seat at that table. And you need to give them your seat and you go to the kitchen. And what I'd like you to do is, whether it's during this closing song that we're going to sing, whether it's on Thanksgiving with your whole family gathered around the table, think of someone who needs that seat. Think of someone who you could write down on here and say, I need to serve them. Think of someone that you would put at that table and give them your seat right now. Because we're a blessed people, but we're blessed to be a blessing. So we're going to sing this song, and it's about the grace that God has shown us. And again, God showed us this grace so that we would be able to serve others with it. Jesus Christ has served us with the bread and the wine so that we can go and serve other people with his body, with his grace, with his redemption. And we have to live in that. So this morning we're going to sing this song about that. And as we do that, I would encourage you to write that down or hold on to that. Think about over Thanksgiving. Maybe you need to come to the altars, and maybe you've been trying to be, you've been thinking of yourself more highly than you should, and maybe you need God, maybe he's calling you out right now. And maybe you need to come to the altar and do some business with him, and that's fine too. If you would, let's stand together. We're going to pray, and then we're going to sing. God, I thank you so much for the example of your son. I thank you for a picture of your son who wasn't afraid to sit at a table with anybody. And even though he was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, he would take the lowest seat. Even though he was deity walking on this earth, he wasn't afraid to go to the kitchen and roll up his sleeves. And God, today, may we be more like that. Would you remove the entitlement, the things that we think we deserve, the things we think we are, God, and remind us not what we are, but whose we are. And because we're yours, we're called to serve. So I pray during this time you would use us. I thank you for this week of Thanksgiving. I pray that you would use it to be a time where we can reach out to others and serve them the way that you've served us. Pray these things in your name. Everybody said, amen.